Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty interesting, and it's all about how people in the U.S. government are communicating these days.
Yeah, it's definitely changed.
And it seems like there's been like this huge surge in the use of these encrypted messaging apps.
Yeah,
And Signal is kind of like at the forefront of all that.
it really is.
So yeah, and for this we've got a bunch of information that we've gathered from different sources, a recent report actually.
Yes.
And it's got interviews from people who actually work in the government. It's
Mhm.
got some expert opinions from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And we even have some data from Sensor Tower,
Right.
the folks who keep track of how many times apps were downloaded.
Exactly.
So, we're going to explore a few big questions with you today.
Sure.
What is it that's really driving government employees towards these encrypted communication tools?
Right.
What could this mean for transparency in government?
Mm-hmm.
Like, does it make it harder for us to know what's going on?
For sure.
And then, really, what does this trend tell us about what's happening inside these government institutions right now?
Yeah, what's that climate like?
So let's just start with Signal.
Okay.
It's really gaining a lot of traction lately.
It is.
A lot of people are using it.
Huge growth. Yeah.
Sensor Tower, they estimate that there have been over 2.7 million downloads of Signal just this year,
In the U.S. alone.
just in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a 36% increase from last year.
It's a huge jump.
Yeah. It really shows you how people are choosing to communicate these days.
It is not just a small bump.
Right.
It's like a real shift.
Definitely.
And what's interesting is the report points out that this surge is not just happening with the general public.
No.
It's actually happening within the federal government itself.
Yes.
So it's not just people in general downloading this app, it's government workers themselves.
Exactly.
So before we even get into the reasons why, I think it's really important to understand that this growth is significant.
Yeah.
It means something. We're not talking about some tiny, obscure app here.
Right.
This kind of growth shows a real change in how people are choosing to connect. And especially in the context of government, it's like, whoa,
For sure.
we got to pay attention to this.
Absolutely.
And the report emphasizes that this isn't just general public interest. It's really reflecting a cultural shift within the government itself.
Yeah.
So why is this happening? Why are these government workers choosing Signal?
Yeah, so Signal, as we mentioned, is managed by a nonprofit, which some people really like.
Right.
But the main attraction, the real reason people are choosing Signal, is because of its end-to-end encryption.
Ah.
So what this tech does is it basically scrambles everything, like your messages and your calls, from the moment they're sent all the way until the person on the other end receives them.
And nobody can see it, right?
No one can access it, not third parties.
It's not even Signal themselves,
It's
right?
not even Signal.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, and so the report calls the people who are super into this secrecy diehards.
Makes sense.
It's a good way to put it.
Secrecy diehards love this.
They love it, and it's also known for collecting very little personal data from users.
Oh, right.
So that's a bonus for privacy-conscious folks.
Makes sense.
It's another level of privacy, and it seems to be a big selling point for a lot of people,
Yeah.
especially, it seems, in the government.
Yeah. And then, there's also that little thing from a while back where
Yeah.
Elon Musk,
Oh, yeah,
pretty influential guy.
definitely.
He basically tweeted, use Signal.
Yeah, that's all it took.
And that seemed to really boost the downloads.
A huge surge.
It just shows how much influence these big names have on these trends.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got the app.
Mm-hmm.
It's secure. It's private. People like it, especially secrecy diehards.
Right.
But why are government workers using it so much?
Here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
So the report has these accounts from people who work for the government, but they all wanted to remain anonymous
Makes sense.
because they're afraid of, what might happen if they spoke openly.
Ah.
So they're all speaking on the condition of anonymity. And what they say is they really feel like they need these more secure communication channels.
Why? What are they afraid of?
It's a lot of different things,
Right.
but it all comes back to this feeling of being watched, like Big Brother's watching.
Right.
And they worry that even just casual conversation.
Like water cooler talk.
Yeah, like just chatting with colleagues
Okay.
or asking a question about layoffs or, those return to office mandates.
Yeah. Are we ever going back to the office?
Exactly. Or even just asking about broader policies. They're worried that any of that could be seen in a negative light, like they're not being loyal.
Wow.
So it's a tense environment.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
A little scary even.
Yeah, it can be. And there's this one example in the report that really stood out. It's this employee from the State Department. And they said that they completely refused to communicate with their colleagues on the official government platforms.
Wow.
Like, at all.
They just don't trust it.
No, they don't.
Okay.
They're afraid of getting singled out and fired.
Just for saying the wrong thing.
Just for expressing any kind of opinion that maybe doesn't perfectly align with the administration.
Wow.
So it's not about leaking classified information.
It's not about being a spy.
No, not at all.
It's about everyday conversations.
Yeah, just the stuff you talk about at work.
And they feel like they can't even do that.
Exactly. They don't feel safe.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
It is. And so what they do is they use Signal on their own phones, their personal phones, and they feel like that's the only space where they can truly have a private conversation with their family, the press, their colleagues.
Okay, so it's a safe space where they could just talk.
Exactly. Unmonitored.
Wow, that's really something.
And the report has this other example that's pretty interesting.
Okay.
It's about some workers at the State Department. And apparently they were asked to write up summaries of what they'd achieved.
Like their accomplishments.
Yeah, their accomplishments. And they were all using Signal to figure out how to handle it.
Oh, like how to respond.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is.
Why were they struggling with that?
It seems like there's a big gap between the official messaging and what's actually happening.
So what they're being told and what's actually going on are different.
Exactly. And this worker said that the official communications from leadership, they tend to be really positive.
Oh.
Everything's great.
But maybe it's not.
Maybe not so much.
Gotcha.
And they're using Signal to share news articles that are more critical.
Oh, so they're getting information from different sources.
Yeah, stuff that you might not see in the official channels.
Okay, so it's like they're trying to get the full picture.
Exactly. They want to know what's really going on.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And it's not even just about work anxieties.
Right.
It's about everything.
Okay.
There's an example of this NASA employee who was hesitant to even post a personal picture online because they were worried that it might be interpreted as acknowledging climate change.
Wow. Seriously.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of the administration's stance on climate change.
So they're self-censoring, basically.
Basically, they're afraid to even express themselves personally online.
Wow. That's a little unsettling.
It's a sign of the times, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. And it's not just anecdotes, right?
Yeah.
It's not just stories.
Right.
The Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, they actually created a tip sheet.
Yeah. For government employees.
Specifically for government employees.
Exactly. On how to make their digital communications secure.
So they're basically saying, hey,
here's how to protect yourselves.
yeah, here's how to protect yourselves. And they recommend Signal.
They do.
So this is like an actual thing.
It's not just a few isolated cases.
Yeah. And there's this quote from Max Stier.
Yeah.
He's from the Partnership for Public Service.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy who's observed the federal government for a long time.
Yeah, he knows what he's talking about.
And he calls this shift in communication norms remarkable.
It is.
He says it's a reversal of decades-long practices.
Absolutely.
And he calls the federal workforce traumatized and deeply fearful.
Strong words.
Strong words.
Yeah, and it really shows you the human side of this.
Yeah.
It's not just about technology. It's about people seeking out tools that make them feel safe and give them some privacy.
Yeah, in a world where they feel like they're constantly being scrutinized.
Exactly.
So it's not just individuals being apprehensive. It's like a potential chilling effect on how people communicate within the government, right?
Absolutely.
Like people are afraid to speak their minds.
Yeah.
Afraid to give honest feedback.
And that could really impact policy discussions and the overall health of these institutions.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's a big concern.
It definitely raises some questions.
Yeah.
But there's another side to all this, right?
There is.
This move towards all these encrypted private channels, it raises questions about transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. So this is where we get into the potential downsides.
Okay, let's hear it.
So Lauren Harper, she's from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. She says that using Signal and these other tactics, it could actually undermine federal records laws.
Oh, wow.
And ethics rules.
Okay, explain that.
So these rules exist to ensure that government correspondence, like emails and stuff, is kept and archived so the public can see it.
Yeah, For transparency.
Right, so everyone can see what's going on in the government.
Okay.
But when these conversations happen on encrypted apps...
Yeah, where they're not officially saved?
Exactly.
What happens?
It becomes a lot harder for the public to know what's really going on.
Yeah, how are we supposed to understand what our government is doing if we can't see the communications?
Right, and Harper really emphasizes this.
Okay.
She says the public needs access to this stuff to understand how decisions are being made.
Right.
And when things move to these private channels...
That we can't see.
Yeah.
We're basically in the dark.
Yes, we don't know what's happening.
Right, and she warns against secrecy on each side.
Meaning?
Meaning that if both sides are operating in secret,
Okay.
it's a problem.
It prevents us from getting the full picture.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the report also mentions the potential loss of a real-time history
Of what?
of communications, especially those from the Trump administration.
Oh, right.
Which could be a big problem for understanding that period in the future.
Yeah, that's a concern.
It is.
If we don't have those records,
Exactly.
we can't really learn from it.
Right.
So how does that even work legally?
Well, there's the Presidential Records Act.
Okay.
And it requires the National Security Council to keep their records.
Okay, but are they doing that on Signal?
That's the problem. The
Yeah.
official email system.
The one they're supposed to use?
Yeah, it's designed for this.
Right.
But platforms like Signal?
They're not.
No, they're not.
So there's like a loophole.
Yeah, basically.
And what about Harper's point about these record-keeping rules?
Oh, yeah, it's interesting.
She said something about preventing reporters from accidentally being included.
Right. She brings up this Pete Hegseth Signal chat that the report talks about.
Oh, right. Tell me about that.
It just highlights how these informal channels can lead to these unintended consequences. Things slip through the cracks.
Right, because it's not official.
Exactly.
It's like casual.
Yeah.
So this whole situation with government officials using private communication, it's not new, right?
It's not. Remember Hillary Clinton's email server?
Oh, yeah.
Big
Yeah,
controversies.
big time.
There are some interesting parallels here.
Yeah, that was all about concerns over classified information.
Right.
And whether there was enough transparency.
Exactly.
The FBI even got involved.
Mhm.
It really impacted her 2016 campaign.
It did.
And isn't it kind of funny or ironic maybe
Yeah, a little bit.
that Pete Hegseth?
The guy who's now the defense secretary.
Yeah, wasn't he pretty vocal back then about Clinton's emails?
He was a commentator at the time.
Right, he was a commentator.
And very critical of Clinton's email practices.
Oh, okay. What did he say?
There's a quote in the report
Okay.
where he says that if someone's hiding top secret information on a private server,
Uh-oh.
it's a very real problem
Yeah.
that could even lead to criminal charges.
Wow. That's pretty strong.
It is. It definitely adds another layer to all of this.
Yeah, now it's like, oh, wait,
Right.
he was criticizing her.
Yeah.
And now it's like,
Now he's in the spotlight.
yeah.
And speaking of Hegseth,
Yeah.
the report talks about the account from Jeffrey Goldberg.
Mm-hmm.
He's a journalist at The Atlantic.
Okay.
And he wrote about this Signal group chat
Okay.
where a user named Pete Hegseth was allegedly sharing details about U.S. military planning.
Whoa, that's serious.
It is. Pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, like sharing secrets.
Yeah, and Goldberg claims these messages included information about weapons, targets, the timing of an operation.
What operation are we talking about?
It was a U.S. military action against Houthi militants.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal.
It is, and while Hegseth has denied all this,
What did he say?
he said nobody was texting war plans.
Okay.
But even if that's true,
Yeah.
it still raises concerns about using these unapproved platforms.
Right, for these sensitive conversations.
Exactly.
And the report is very clear.
Yeah.
Signal, just like Clinton's email server,
Right.
it is not approved for sharing classified information.
No, absolutely not.
That seems pretty basic.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But clearly it's not always followed.
Yeah, and it's not just hypothetical.
Right. Yeah.
There's a real case in the report.
Mhm.
This federal judge ordered the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, right,
OGE, yeah.
to hand over documents, including signal messages.
Yes.
Because they were worried about all these unorthodox communications.
Right. Unconventional.
And what's even more concerning is that DOGE said they don't have to comply with FOIA requests.
Yeah, which is a big red flag.
What's FOIA again?
It's the Freedom of Information Act.
Right, the
Yeah.
one that gives us the right to see government records.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Signal's end-to-end encryption, it does protect messages from being intercepted.
But there are still vulnerabilities.
There are, you're right.
Right.
Even with the encryption, the messages are still visible on the devices.
Oh, right, on the phones themselves.
Yes, and if a phone is compromised with malware or spyware,
Like Pegasus, right?
like Pegasus,
Yeah.
then they can get everything.
Even with the encryption.
They can bypass it.
Wow.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that there are very different views on Signal.
Okay, tell me about that.
So some people love it for its privacy,
Yeah, that makes sense.
but others think it's a risk to national security.
Ah, okay.
So one of the arguments against encrypted communication
Mm-hmm.
is that it helps bad guys,
Okay.
like criminals or terrorists,
Right.
because it's hard for law enforcement to see what they're doing.
Right, so they could be planning something bad,
Exactly.
and we wouldn't even know.
Exactly, and intelligence agencies can't really keep tabs on them.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But there's another side to that, right?
There is, yeah.
What about that quote from Brian Hughes at the National Security Council?
Oh, yeah.
The one about Hegseth's signal messages?
Right, so he actually sees those messages as a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials.
Wow, that's a very different way of looking at it.
It is.
So it's all about perspective, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What one person sees as a risk.
Someone else sees as good communication,
Yeah.
efficient.
Okay.
It just depends on where you stand
Right.
on the issue.
So it seems like this rise of signal within the government, it's a complicated thing.
It is, for sure.
There are a lot of factors at play.
Definitely.
I mean, on one hand, you have this desire for secure communication.
Right. People want to feel safe.
Yeah, especially in a climate where people are feeling scared.
And where things are changing so fast.
Exactly. But then there's also this issue of transparency.
A big one.
And whether these private channels are undermining the laws that are supposed to keep things open and accountable.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about those past controversies.
Right, like with Clinton's emails.
Yeah. It all seems connected somehow.
It is.
It all comes back to this tension between privacy and security versus transparency and accountability.
Exactly. Two very important principles.
Yeah. It's a tough one.
It is.
So as we wrap up here,
Yeah.
here's something I want you to think about.
Okay.
As technology keeps evolving
Mm-hmm.
and how we communicate changes,
Mm-hmm.
how do we as a society find the right balance?
Good question.
Yeah, how do we make sure the government has the security and privacy they need to function?
Yeah.
But also make sure we, the public, can see what's going on.
That's the key.
Yeah, because that's what keeps things accountable.
Right.
And what about the long-term effects of all this?
Mm.
How is this changing communication landscape going to affect our understanding of how the government works?
It's definitely something to consider. It is. It really is.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. And thanks for being here with us as we unpack it.
Of course.
It's been great.
Always a pleasure.
And for all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep those questions coming.
Keep digging
Duh.
for the truth.